My teachers used to force us to exchange love notes. We were given lists of everyone in the class and made to spend money on themed boxes of cards with uncomfortably personal sayings. Be mine. Someone likes you. You're so pretty. I love you so much. The idea was to be anonymous in our delivery. But when 25 kids are all stumbling over each other in a room meant to handle 15, it's not exactly a discreet process. Some kids went home with lollipops expertly fashioned to the cards. A few enthusiastic parents made goodie bags with Pez dispensers and colored paper. Sacrifices to the elite of our class. One kid, always one kid, never got anything. Despite the lists and the rules against discrimination and the fact that she was always nice to everyone, there was always one desk left horribly, obviously bare. I always told myself I didn't mind. But that was elementary school, when the ultimate display of affection was pushing each other on the swings. And at some point down the line, people discovered how to order bouquets of roses and perfected the art of making out in full view and way of everyone except the teachers. I guess cards are sort of obsolete, but people get other things, mostly fluffy, button-eyed things with bows like nooses around their necks. The fact that those things never used to make it to me was my own fault. I know that. I know I should be more outgoing, or prettier, or just better. But it's more comforting to blame everyone else instead. That's the kind of mood I was in early last week when I was sitting on my polka dot bed scrolling through frilly websites complete with gifs of dogs chewing heart-shaped treats. Not because I was bitter or anything, just that Valentine's Day was coming up and I had to do a love letter for creative writing. Fishing for inspiration, even if resentment was the only fish biting. I clicked a random link, and a brightly colored interface popped up. It was flat, red, with a few sparse graphics, a title, and a button beaming, "Sign up today." A character was posed on the bottom of the screen, looking up at the button. It was impossible to tell if it was a baby or a child. Its head was swollen out and up, with a minuscule torso for 4 fat limbs. Tufts of blonde hair swooped over huge blue eyes, and everything about it, from its blue clothes to its red skin, was grossly oversaturated. The title was Instant Valentine. Curious, I hovered over the sign-up button, not really sure what I was expecting. Part of me thought it was just going to be a joke. That text would flash, calling me a loser, and somehow add me to a public spreadsheet of how many others had clicked the link. I clicked it anyway. And instead a form popped up, asking for an email and a name. Bad as this is gonna sound, I never really cared about giving away my email to sites like this. I did it often enough at malls to get Wi-Fi, and with those sketchy grade saver websites. I figured as long as I never put my real name, I wasn't really giving anything up. Now I know better. I typed in my email and an alias I spent 30 seconds choosing. Gwen. It's the name I used to wish I had, from when Ben 10 was my favorite show in the world. A minute later, I got a notification and checked my email, again expecting an advert or punchline. I've transcribed it here. To Gwen, you light my life. Be mine? There was no sender. The email was just the site name and a string of numbers. I opened the attachment and found a drawing of a little girl holding a candle. It looked like the first mascot, too red and lumpy, like those vintage Cheer-Up kids. Some kind of gushy mailing list. Cool. I closed the email and went to bed a while later, secretly a little excited by the idea of a digital admirer. This was last week. The next morning, I checked my email again, and there was another note from Instant Valentine. Gwen, you look sweet enough to eat. Be my Valentine. Attached was another old-timey drawing of a girl sitting in a comically large cauldron and open fire beneath. I know it's dumb, but something about the notes was reassuring. They were something to look forward to, for one, but they were also windows into another world. Gwen's world. A world where I could be loved. I could be wanted. The notes kept coming. All of them came with drawings, increasingly saturated. A pirate shoving a gooey hook through a girl's heart. Let's hook up, girl. Be mine? A Betty Boop type with rubber hose legs and a melting pile around her, bright flames eating away her skin. You're hot stuff, Valentine. Be mine? A little devil holding a pitchfork with hearts at the tips. Only her expression was twisted with pain, and the horn and tail looked surgically attached. I'll love you from hell and back. Be mine. At first, the art was charming in a weird way. Stuff you'd find in a garage sale or an attic. But as the week progressed, they only got more graphic. I tried to Google the pictures by description, hoping to find the artist, and came up empty. I Googled Instant Valentine. Nothing relevant. I couldn't even find the original site anymore, and I didn't remember the random series of clicks that got me there in the first place. But I wasn't too worried. More curious than anything. I didn't even realize how much I enjoyed the daily acknowledgement until some girls from class asked if I had even had a boyfriend yet. As I walked away from them, I wondered why I'd said yes. The days passed. I started filling out Gwen's world a bit. I imagined her as a perfect version of me. Taller, smoother skin, a smile like Gatsby, and a voice like Daisy. Gwen was confident, and everyone wanted to be her Valentine. I even created a persona for the note giver. I called him Josh, and he grew inside my head as a shy, artsy kid who'd been in love with Gwen since they were kids. Love you, dear. Be mine. Gwen's friends recoiled from the bloodied carcass of a girl wearing a sexy deer costume painted across the page, but she knew it was special. I gained another reason to hate Valentine's Day. I knew the notes would probably stop then. But sometime in the last few days, the notes began to change. They stopped being addressed to Gwen and started being addressed to me. I spent an hour trying to figure out how it, knew my name. My lame conclusion was that it could read other emails in my inbox, although I'm still not sure. The thought chilled me, but there wasn't a way to cancel the subscription. I couldn't even reply to the email. So I did nothing, waiting for the issue to resolve itself. The cheesy pickup lines thinned out. Replacing them were constant emails, several per day, with just 2 words. Be mine? Be mine. Be mine. The drawings were still there, but they were wrong somehow. Like the ink was running. Smudged and blackened faces screamed at me from my computer screen. Always different girls. One was wearing a bikini or underwear, and her head was submerged in a bathtub. Another, chubbier girl had on a pig costume and was roasting over a spit with an apple between her lips. Those things had been okay in Gwen's world, but now they were real, threatening. I need you to know that I wanted to show someone, friends or parents even. I need you to know that I tried, but I couldn't bring myself to. The embarrassment would have crushed me. And I think maybe there was still a tiny part, a sick and shriveled thing just under my skin, living in my fingertips and between my hips, that wanted to keep it secret. Wanted to have something all my own. And maybe that part of me was glad to see my name grace the screen, because just as quickly as I'd created Gwen, I started to resent her. I need you to know this, because I deserve it. There's always a new girl in the drawings. They're getting worse. I can hear their screams. Today is Valentine's Day, and I'm sitting alone in the cafeteria, surrounded by red things. Fluffy, lacy things. Everyone has a rose. The office is giving them away so no one will feel left out. I didn't pick one up. I had to write this down. I just checked my email again. Happy Valentine's Day, it said. Let's tie the knot. The picture is in that same ridiculous style, but the ink looks fresh and the lines are sharp. The girl has ugly brown hair pulled into pigtails, and she's sitting on a polka dot bedspread. Heavy ropes crisscross her body. There's tape over her mouth, but she doesn't look afraid. My mom just called me, saying I need to come home. She said she was picking me up. I can see her car through the windows. The person inside is not my mother. An office aide is walking around the cafeteria with a green slip, looking for me to send me away. Only a matter of time now. The bed in the drawing looks like my bed. The girl in the drawing is wearing my clothes and has my hairstyle. I wish I was afraid. The office aide is making eye contact, walking toward me. The car outside is honking. A girl is crying over spilling her chocolates. There are roses in the garbage bin. Mascara is running, but I'm not. I should be afraid. Happy Valentine's Day.
I had managed to keep a healthy skepticism of ghosts, ghouls, and all things supernatural until I was 28. I found most claims of such things to be dubious at best and harmful at worst. I was very much in the camp of the classical sciences, as I had studied physics at Edinburgh University several years earlier. While my profession had never taken me back into the scientific arena, I had until this time maintained a ruthless opposition to pseudoscience and superstition. My friends often wonder about the change they saw in me at the time. What surprised them was that it wasn't a slow, steady change of heart, but rather a complete turnaround overnight, a transformation, if you will. It may have appeared as it occurred so very quickly, but in fact it happened over a slightly longer timescale, 2 weeks to be precise. It was February. In fact, it was the week of Valentine's Day. Around this time, I was going through a socially isolated phase. It's something which often happens in the bleak Scottish winters, where I become increasingly wrapped up in my own loneliness and passing bitterness at those who fit in. It was, and still is, a neurotic hangover from my teenage years. One which has plagued me for far too long. 2 weeks earlier, I had found myself wandering through the cobbled streets of Edinburgh to clear my head. Walking, as amusing as it may seem, has always been a great comfort to me. You are, in every sense, alone with your thoughts, but that part of you which craves the company of others is slightly appeased by being in the world, even if you're only in it long enough to share a glance with a passing stranger. Edinburgh is a very old city, and has remarkably kept much of its former self. The cobbled streets meander down the steep side of what was once a volcano, breaking off sporadically into narrow lanes, which occasionally open up into secluded courtyards. These numerous courtyards are often flanked on all sides by tall terrace houses, huddled together as if whispering of a secret and long-forgotten past. The impressiveness of Edinburgh as a city is often lost on those who have lived there long enough to find beauty commonplace. As often happens when gripped by depression, I hadn't been sleeping well. I had finished work the previous evening around 5 p.m, and while I managed to get a few hours sleep, my mind just wouldn't let me relax. Come 6 in the morning, even though it was a Sunday and I could for once have a long lie, I conceded defeat in my attempts to have a proper rest, and got up to greet the world, however reluctantly. By the time I had set out, it was still early morning, and the cold January air stung my face. Although Edinburgh is, for want of a better expression, a tourist city, at the time it still seemed relatively deserted, even for a Sunday. A slight mist had risen out of the water of Leith, making it feel all the more colder as I passed through the narrow lanes and down empty pavements, entirely oblivious to where I was going. As the shops opened and the first trickle of tourists bled out onto the cobbled walkways from their hotels, I deliberately headed for a quieter, often forgotten network of streets. My wandering mind had indeed taken over, for as I broke through the haze of a daydream, I found myself standing at the gates of an old graveyard. I had been thinking of turning back and heading home, but something about this place awoke a compulsion in me. I had to explore it. I found it curious that the gates constructed out of blackened steel rods were lying unlocked as early in the day as this. Entering the cemetery, I immediately noticed the overall isolation of the place, enjoying the sound of gravel under my feet, which pierced the silence as I moved slowly along the path littered with small white stones. It wasn't a large graveyard. It seemed to consist of two separate plots, with the older graves at the front bordering the fence and gate, filling backwards up onto a diminutive nearby hill where the more recently deceased residents lay. The oldest graves bore the weathered scars of age. I found one which was dated 1776, but the epitaph was illegible. I felt sadness staring onto the headstone, wondering about who it belonged to, and indulgently contemplating about myself as a forgotten or lost soul. Eventually I moved off, wandering up the hill towards the newer graves. I found myself drawn to a large old sycamore tree, which loomed over several graves below it, with an almost protective demeanour. I stared at one of the headstones, reading the words but not registering them, as my mind was engulfed by yet another daydream. The grave stood out somewhat from those around it. The headstone was white in colour, while those which accompanied it were forged out of a deep black marble. Without thinking, I ran my hand over the smooth stone, feeling the occasional mark of the elements upon it. At the foot of the headstone lay a small, innocuous vase. It was made of a brownish metal, copper I assumed, as the surface exhibited small veins which were blue in colour due to its exposure to the weather. As I stood there, something rose up out of my mind, something which bothered me greatly. At first I did not know what it was, experiencing it merely as a low-growing sense of discomfort. As the feeling of unease reached its crescendo, I suddenly realised what was wrong. The name on the grave was Lisa Main. I knew that name well. Everyone in the local area did. I had known her when I was growing up, as we went to the same school together. She was someone I watched from afar, full of life and exuberance, while I was shy, reclusive and reserved. I possessed that intense infatuation and desire for her which only a first love can produce. The words on her headstone came into sharp focus. Age 15. I was overcome with a tremendous sense of grief and loss, one which took me entirely by surprise, so much so that I had to leave that place. I just couldn't bear it. As someone who prides himself on being level-headed and immune to flights of fancy, I could not shake the profound unease which comes with outrageous coincidence. I exited the graveyard as quickly as possible and headed home, ignoring the now cluttered Edinburgh streets. I did not look back. Over the following few days or so, I was preoccupied. I was overworked and was having trouble sleeping, but that was not unusual for me. What was unusual were the immovable thoughts and memories of Lisa Main, thoughts which now stayed with me wherever I would go. I had been terribly affected by her death, as we were only 15 years old at the time, but that was over a decade ago, and I had not thought of her for many years. It was as if seeing that gravestone had awoken a sense of loss, a sense of pain, which I had managed to bury so far deep inside of me that I had persuaded even myself to forget it. A cacophony of memories now haunted me, beautiful and terrifying. At any one moment I would be exhilarated by the thought of her smile, her hair, her kindness, and at the very next engulfed by despair at the image of her lying under 6 feet of earth, cold and alone. once full of life, now a decaying husk, which had long ago housed that beautiful soul. If I had told anyone how I felt, they would have called me overly emotional or sentimental, for the fact remained, I barely knew Lisa. Watching her from years across a classroom, I imagined myself talking with her, sharing those intoxicating moments which mean so much to a teenager, the first connection with someone you adore, the first feeling of being loved, the first kiss. I had in fact hardly ever spoken to her until only a few weeks before she died, in one of those embarrassing manoeuvres which teachers often pull. The pupils were all forcibly partnered with someone to take our first social dance. Social dancing was a torrid affair. For someone like Lisa, it was fun and to be enjoyed, while for me it was something to be detested. I was embarrassed, possessing none of the talent to be a dancer, and even more so afraid to spend time with a girl, held back by my own teenage awkwardness. It was the end of January, and Lisa quickly set me at ease in social dancing class where we practiced. I cannot convey the simultaneous sense of joy and fear which I felt when she asked me to walk her home that day. Some people find social interactions to be exhausting, much like myself, always worried about saying the wrong thing. But some individuals can set others at ease with the smallest of effort. Lisa was one of those people. As we walked along the elegantly Victorian bridge towards her house, the winter sun bathed our surroundings in a cool, comforting glow. I couldn't have been more content to be in the presence of this happy, kind-hearted girl. She was so beautiful, with an incredible smile, and golden locks of hair which seemed more at home in a fairy tale than our surroundings. For weeks we walked the same route home every day, talking, laughing, something I rarely did, and growing even closer. When you're that age, everything is so potent. Most can fall in and out of love in a heartbeat. I didn't have many friends, and lived alone with my mother, who was not a particularly affectionate woman. So in that short time, I fell in love with Lisa Main. On the 13th of February, we stopped outside her house. We stood talking for a moment, and then for the first time Lisa became distant. She stared straight at me in a way that she had never done before. I felt uneasy, yet exhilarated. There was a moment, a tiny moment, where we said nothing to one another. Then she hugged me. Her fingers slid through my hair. I will never forget how sweet she smelled, how alive she felt, and how grateful I was to someone for showing me a kindness I had never previously known. Lisa slowly let go of me and then skipped up to her front door. Just before she disappeared, she turned and smiled at me one more time. Then she was gone. Immediately, I knew what I was going to do. For the first time in my life, I was full of purpose and focus. A desire to do just one thing. I ran as fast as I could to the local shops. I was lucky as most of them were shutting up for the day. A kind old man who ran a rarely used card store allowed me to go into his shop even though he was just closing. I was going to buy my first Valentine's card. It had to be perfect. It had to be just right. After looking at almost every card I could afford, I found one. It was Fate. The card was red with a white circle in the middle. In that circle was a boy and girl walking hand in hand into the distance together. I did not care what it said inside, because I have always had a way with the written word, and knew I could put something down which came from the heart. I bought it. After leaving the card shop, I went straight into my local newsagent's. I had kept aside my last £2. My mother gave me an allowance to buy my lunch at school every week, and I knew she would not give me more should I spend it. Despite it meaning I would have to go without lunch for a few days, I bought a box of chocolates to accompany the card. I rushed home, walked straight past my mother, who barely greeted me, grabbed a pair of scissors from the kitchen and went upstairs. I knew I would get into an unbelievable amount of trouble for it, but I didn't care. I cut a sliver of material from the red curtains hanging in my mother's room and tied the makeshift ribbon around the box of chocolates. In my mind, it now looked like a Valentine's gift. I wrote in the card explaining how much I felt about Lisa and how much those walks home had meant to me, signed it, sealed the envelope, and slid it under the ribbon so it sat nicely with the chocolates. I waited for the next day. It came all too slowly. The 14th of February. I will never forget the excitement of getting ready for school. I took one last look at the chocolates and card before slipping them into my bag. I think I made it a little too obvious that I was carrying something important and delicate, as I cradled the whole bag in my arms for most of the day. I was so enthused, so focused that I was going to march straight up to Lisa and give her the gift without a care for what the others, some of whom could be very cruel, would think. But she was not there. She wasn't in the playgrounds, she wasn't in her classes. For the subjects we shared, I just sat and stared at her empty desk and chair. School finished and I found myself walking the same route Lisa and I would normally. I stood outside our house holding the chocolates. I can't describe the feeling I experienced there. Call it the effects of a lack of food or the exhaustion of having been so primed for the day. But anxiety took me as a result. I couldn't bring myself to knock on her door. I went home, dejected. I couldn't so much as eat a bite of the undercooked ham my mother threw down in front of me. So I simply went upstairs and crawled into bed, barely sleeping all night. For the next 2 days, I walked that same route and found myself holding on to those chocolates, not daring to cross the threshold of the little white fence in front of Lisa's house. On the 3rd day, I asked our teachers about Lisa's absence, something which just hadn't occurred to me to do. I associated any authority with being cold, distant and unfair, and as a result normally avoided contact with my teachers at any cost. Mr. Randall, our history teacher, told me that Lisa had come down with a bad fever and was very ill. She could be off for weeks. With the news, I was resolute. I was going to knock on her door and knock on her door as just what I did. I knocked and knocked and knocked, but no one answered. The next day, I did the same and again. No one answered. It had now been 5 days since I had last seen Lisa. It was a Saturday, and once again, I went over to Lisa's house, chocolates and card in hand. As I approached her house, the sky clouded over, casting a dull hue over Lisa's seemingly deserted street. It was clear to see that Lisa's father was not a gardener. The garden path split an overgrown and patchy lawn in two, with clambering weeds stretching up towards the sun through numerous cracks in the concrete slabs. I stopped to look around and focused my gaze on what seemed to be a smallish gnome figurine smothered in undergrowth. It had sadly been broken. Many suggest that when something is wrong, a person knows. They may not be aware of precisely what has happened, but they can almost feel a palpable sense of dread in the air. I looked around and continued towards the front door. Something was different. I was sure that the house had seemed as deserted as it had on the previous days I had visited, and while the house was for all intents and purposes exactly the same as before, there was one change. The front door was open. I was convinced that it had been shut when I had arrived, but I dismissed this as simply the byproduct of my fascination with the condition of Lisa's garden. You see, I can't quite explain it, but there was something suffocating about the house on that quiet street. I reached the door and grasped the door knocker, chapping 3 times. No answer. I repeated my knocks more forcefully this time, but still no one came. The door was only slightly ajar, and as such I couldn't really see much of the interior. All I could tell was that the house was dark, and that the air escaping through the doorway was musty, as if nothing had stirred inside for days. I started to feel nervous. I didn't really know why. Clearing my throat and stammering slightly, I asked, "Hello?" several times without an answer. The street was empty, and the whole place felt devoid of life. Then a thought began to ruminate and gather momentum within me. What if Lisa and her father were hurt? I started to play out all the possibilities in my mind, the 2 of them lying somewhere in the house injured without food or water for days. Then I remembered that my history teacher had said that Lisa was ill. He must have spoken to someone to know this, possibly Lisa's father. I had hoped that she was not so sick that her father had taken her to hospital. Despite the logic of my thoughts, I still could not dismiss the horrible feeling that something was indeed wrong. Fear began to grip me. Yet I closed my eyes only for a moment and found the memory of Lisa's embrace all the solace I needed to overcome it. I held on tightly to the card and chocolates as I pushed the door fully open. It moved silently, but I was sure the noise of it hitting a doorstop on the floor would alert anyone to my presence as the bang echoed throughout the house. But still no one came. The house was bathed in darkness. I took one last look around me and crossed the threshold. While Lisa did not come from an affluent family, The house had an upstairs and must have had at least 4 bedrooms with an attic. Perhaps the fact that Lisa was an only child made the house seem all the larger or emptier. But I slowly made my way down the hallway. I felt as if each footstep echoed throughout distant passages and rooms. Beginning with the living room on the ground floor, I moved from room to room, occasionally asking if anyone could hear me. But I quickly became aware that I was only talking to myself. The air was stiflingly hot, and running my hand across a radiator, I realised that the boiler must have been on for some time. As I moved into the kitchen at the rear of the house, I heard something. It was an almost rhythmic dull thudding. I couldn't identify what it was, but I knew it was coming from somewhere upstairs. I left the kitchen, which I was glad to do as it was filled with the smell of rotting food, and walked to the foot of the stairs. The staircase was quite narrow, and ran along the inside of a wall. At the top of the stairs was a landing which curved round to the left and led onto the other rooms. The dull thudding was now more pronounced, and as I slowly climbed the stairs, the same fear which had gripped me at the door returned. The realisation of wandering into someone's house uninvited came to the fore. Stopping for a moment, I closed my eyes and thought of Lisa again. I continued on. As I reached the top of the stairs, the thudding noise stopped. I shudder now even just thinking about it. There were 3 doors leading to the other bedrooms, and 1 leading to a bathroom which I could already see was empty. The door to the first bedroom lay opened. I peered in slowly, almost expecting to find someone there. There was no one. It was Lisa's father's room, neat, organised, with almost no objects of any note. The only curiosity was that the curtains were not drawn. The door to the second room was closed. Again, I was overcome with a sense of intrusion. I was walking around inside someone's house without invitation. In effect, I was a trespasser. I knocked on the door quietly. Waiting for a moment, I realised the room must have been empty and turned the brass handle on the door. It opened. As I pushed the door, it creaked and then suddenly stopped, only after a few inches of movement. Something was behind the door. I pulled it towards me and then pushed again, but no luck. With each attempt, the wooden door bashed off something. I suddenly became aware of the noise I was making as each attempt echoed throughout the house. It was not dissimilar to the thudding I had heard before. I tried one more time, pushing against the obstacle as hard as I could. No luck. I was about to give up and move on to the next door when I saw what was blocking my entrance. I will never forget the cold, glassy stare of the face, which seemed to be peeking out from behind the bottom of the door. The skin a pallid grey, a few retreating locks of hair covering an otherwise balding head, globules of sweat congealed under. Most of his features were obscured by the door, but the only visible eye stared, clouded and covered in shadow. I didn't scream because I quickly realised that not only was this the face of Lisa's father, but that he had been very much dead. I felt numb. But looking back, I realised I handled the situation much more calmly than many of my age would have. But then, I did have a strange fascination for such things, reading many accounts of quite horrific death scenes. I stared for a moment, composed myself, and then instantly turned to thoughts of Lisa and where she might be. Was she in the same room? Was she in the attic? All I could hope for was that she was okay. Something then happened, an event which I have to this day repressed, ignored, and avoided as much as I possibly could. Something which shook me to the core. Something which I have never told a soul. The face staring up at me through that gloom-filled gap in the doorway moved. At first it was only slight, and I disregarded it as the effect of shock. Then it moved again. Suddenly, the door began to shake violently as if being punched and kicked by the body lying behind it. The head turned upwards as the cracking of rigor mortis from the neck struggled against each sharp and vicious move. A putrid gurgling sound gasped out, enraged from deep within his bloated throat. I closed my eyes. I was sure it was not real. The banging stopped, and the house fell once again into silence. I let out a sigh of relief and opened my eyes. What I saw I can barely describe now. The face had moved upwards from behind the door to the level with mine. The door shook and rattled under the strain as its venomous attacker tried to claw and batter its way through. Finally, the face pushed and squeezed through the gap of the door, revealing its repulsively loathsome features in its entirety. Dead, swollen with clotted blood, gasping relentlessly for air, all this time staring straight at me through hate-filled eyes, with lips pulled back over teeth gritted together, grinding against one another in wretched hatred. I do not remember much of what took place after that. Perhaps I'm glad to. I know I escaped, and I know that I ran home confused, crying, babbling like a madman. I also know one more thing. While the memory had been pushed so deep inside that I can barely recognize it, I know whatever was in that room slipped through the gap in that doorway, slipped through and grabbed me. How I escaped, I do not know. The truth was more horrifying than I could have imagined. Lisa's father lost his job a couple of weeks earlier. As bills mounted, combined with the pressures of looking after his only child, he snapped. When the police entered the house, they found poor sweet Lisa's body in the cellar. Her wrists were tied to a radiator. She had been strangled to death. After killing his daughter, Lisa's father had then went upstairs and hanged himself in her room. After a few days of hanging there, the cord he used to choke the life from himself seemed to have snapped. The police found his body slumped behind the bedroom door. The door was open. As time eroded the memory, the explanation of these events altered greatly. Through my years of study at school and then university, I read of psychological pressures and how trauma could bring about vivid hallucinations. I had convinced myself that I had found Lisa's father dead and that shock had produced the rest of the experience. No matter how real it felt, the idea that a corpse twisted by rage and hate, perhaps even by the love I felt for his daughter, could somehow come back to life and attack the living just did not fit in with my scientific and atheistic understanding of the world. I dismissed the entire experience, but one thing had still managed to haunt me until I managed to hide it from myself. The police reported that Lisa had been tied up for a couple of days before she was killed. The date of her death was recorded as the 15th of February. She had been in that cellar, tied up, frightened yet alive when I had come by to give her her Valentine's gift. People talk about hauntings and spirits, but the memory of that contorted face rising up through the doorway was nothing compared to the knowledge that, had I went into her house that day, that maybe, just maybe, I could have saved her. Yes, I was a child, but I could have done something! I grew up, but I never felt that love again, that feeling of connection with another human being. I developed an unhealthy attachment to my own company, and found myself more interested in burying my head in textbooks than perhaps meeting others, or even falling in love. The friends that I did have were never that close to me, nor did they ever truly understand who I was. Seeing Lisa's grave had brought it all flooding back to me. Those stolen moments, that thing in the house, her death. The funny thing is that of all those memories, both traumatic and precious, the one thought that would not leave me was of the Valentine's gift I never gave. While I still hoped that the dead things in Lisa's house was one of my own imagination, and that the world was still very much material, lacking in the spiritual, I still felt the need to rectify this. I had kept the card all those years. In many ways, it was both my most cherished and loathed possession. Cherished for the memories which it drew up from within me, and loathed for the same reason. On the morning of the 14th, I walked through the cobbled streets of Edinburgh towards Lisa's resting place. On the way, I stopped at a little newsagent's and picked up a box of chocolates. On my first visit, I had wandered there by accident, vaguely negotiating each street in a daze. But this time, I was focused and resolute. Sentiment is a curious thing, and it had encouraged me to keep not only the card, but also the ribbon I made for the chocolates. When I entered the graveyard, I gazed up towards that lonely hill where she lay. I felt hesitant, not because I did not want to leave the gifts by her graveside, but more so because I did not know the extent to which the feelings of remorse, sadness and bitter nostalgia would overcome me again. Nevertheless, I took a moment and then made my way up over the whitened path, up towards the hill, up towards her. There I stood. The sun was still relatively low in the sky, and it cast long, contorted and exaggerated shadows over everything. After standing there for what seemed like an age, I pulled out the ribbon, tied it carefully around the box, and then placed the chocolates in the card against the cold headstone. I don't know if I said anything. At the time, I probably didn't, as I was still convinced that she wasn't there to hear me, that once your loved ones pass away, they're gone forever, that death is the end. I do know that I cried. I cried like I hadn't since I was a child. I fell to my knees and buried my head in my hands. I was inconsolable. Those moments of utter sadness, utter despair at the cruelness of life and what it had done to beautiful Lisa were the last I had as a true skeptic. For as I knelt there, the wind blew gently through the graveyard, gently caressing those stone markers of loss and those who attended them. I had heard and read about people having a religious or spiritual experience, and while I cannot truly accept others' testimonies, I can say that what I felt at that moment was profound, an achingly beautiful feeling of companionship and love. I looked around. No one was there. But I felt that someone was. I tried to shake the feeling off as my mind simply playing tricks on me, but no matter how much I tried to stick to the interpretation of events, I simply could not do it. That feeling shared a twin emotion. I had only once ever felt that way before, when Lisa hugged me the last time I saw her. As the sensation washed over me, I realised that I had truly been searching for the same feeling again, but never found it until that moment. I stood up, wiped my eyes, and touched the gravestone as if to say goodbye. I walked to the graveyard entrance with a smile which stretched from ear to ear, something anyone who knows me will tell you is extremely unusual. When I reached the gate, I glanced once more at the hill, which for me was no longer a sight of loneliness, but one of love and friendship. The second and last time I can say I have ever seen a ghost was at that moment, for standing up on the hill beside Lisa's grave was the blurry image of a young girl in a pink social dancing dress. I did not run to the grave because I knew I did not have to. She waved slowly at me and then disappeared behind her gravestone. I walked home. I felt full, joyful, and exuberant. It is almost impossible to describe the experience by the graveside. Perhaps completeness will do for now, but even that cannot convey it. Friends wonder what happened to me around that time. The truth is that I found something I didn't know was missing. Some reading this may think that I found my faith, but it was not that at all. What I found that day was companionship and acceptance from the only person I had ever truly loved. I knew from that day onward that the world was a far more mysterious and wonderful place than I could have possibly imagined. I knew that I would never fear being alone, for when I go wandering through the streets of Edinburgh and find myself on a quiet stretch of road, I smile to myself, knowing that if I listen carefully, I can hear the footsteps of Lisa, that girl I loved so dearly when I was a child, walking with me wherever I go.
Suzanne knew there was something different about his eyes. The minute she painted them, they seemed to have a life of their own. The canvas stood up in her studio as she practiced away on her latest work of art. She was excited about this painting. She believed it might be the one that defined her. Her masterpiece. She left it for the day and headed to bed that night. Though the whole time she was trying to sleep, all she could hear was a voice whisper in her head.
I need you. I need you.
She didn't understand. She thought it was just sleep deprivation and nothing else. She always suffered from sleepless nights. The next day, she continued on with the painting. She painted his lips and chin, a soft smile on his mouth, and she smiled back. She continued, touching up his clothes and making the fabric look more real. He really was such a handsome man. If only he were real. That night, when she lay in bed, she swore she heard the voice scream this time.
I need you. I need you.
And a scraping at her door. She woke up in her bed the minute her eyes started to drift and looked around frantically for what had frightened her so. There was nothing there. The last day, her eyes were so dreary. Her sleep had not been good the last 2 nights, but hopefully with the finishing of this picture, she would finally have her accomplishment and be able to sleep easy. She added a little more texture to his dark blue eyes. His brown, wavy hair tousled a little over his forehead. He was beautiful. She was nearly done. Just one more stroke. She placed the brush on his pupil and dabbed the black gently on it. His eyes shining now, and she smiled.
Beautiful,
she whispered to herself. She had done a good job. Everything seemed to go so quiet then as she admired her fine work. He looked so real. So unreal in his beauty, and she blinked her eyes gently before opening them weakly back up. But when she did, she was certain the painting looked different, like he had changed positions slightly. She drew close, expecting it to see what had changed, and as she looked at him slowly, he blinked. She shrieked. He suddenly ripped out of the painting, grabbing her and pulling her in. She screamed as she tried to tear away, her cries of terror echoing around the room as he yelled back.
I need you! I need you!
She cried in agony as she was ripped into the painting, before it dropped to the ground and snapped in half. Red blood began to spill out from it into a puddle on the ground. It drenched the original picture so that the beautiful painting of the man was destroyed. The studio remained silent after that. The blood stopped dripping out. No one saw Suzanne again.
Jennifer was her name. She was young, a lot younger than me. I'm 35 and she was 21. She was intelligent, small, and she honestly looked like a Greek goddess. But what I loved the most about her were her eyes. I still love them. They are beautiful, round and blue as the ocean. I could get lost in them for the rest of my life, and that's what I wanted. I was determined to make that happen. She only had to notice me first. I've done this before. I've played the cat and mouse game, and I almost always win. But it had been a while since my last chase, and I had to get back in the game. Jennifer worked at the fast food I often ate at. She knew my order by heart: steak and cheese, a Coke, and a cookie. But this didn't mean that she had noticed me. She had asked my name, and there were a few exchanged hellos, how are yous, small talk. It was nice. I somehow felt that she genuinely wanted to know how I was doing when she asked. I called in sick at work so I could plan how that day would go. The day I asked her out. I knew Jennifer would be working that day because she always is, but I'd arrived at a different hour, and hopefully a less busy hour in hopes of starting a conversation. Now, this does sound rather stalker-like, but it really isn't. I don't stalk. It's boring. Takes too long. It isn't interesting, and it definitely isn't as fun as what I do. So, to the day I called in sick, I woke up at around 8 a.m. and planned to be at her workplace at 11 a.m., which gave me time to spruce up and make myself look my best. I'm a decent-looking guy. The women I've been with always told me that I had a certain charm. It was always appreciated. They didn't really have time to tell me more than once. We always got busy. Back to the point. I spruced up, wore something that smelt good, I don't even know what it was, and wore nice clothes. Don't worry, I didn't show up wearing a tux. That was reserved for the date I was most definitely going to ask her on. I got to the fast food, and much to my satisfaction, it was practically empty. I scanned the place for her, and managed to get a glimpse of her behind the counter. Even in her uniform, she was beautiful. And those eyes, I would do anything for. I took a deep breath and walked up to her. Hey, hi there.
Hi there! You're here early. Steak and cheese, a coconut cookie?
She said as she started tapping on the screen. Nope, not today. I wanted to know what you would recommend, I said, giving her a half smile and keeping steady eye contact.
Honestly, not much. Serving sandwiches all day makes me sick.
Oh, well, what restaurants would you recommend then? I felt a tap on my shoulder.
Excuse me, sir, are you gonna order something?
Damn, I ran out of time. No, sorry, I'll be out of your way in just a few seconds. I turned back to face Jennifer. How about I take you to a restaurant of your choice, and you just have to tell me when you get off work? I beamed at her, giving my best smile and most charming look. She blushed. Perfect.
I get off this evening at 7. We can meet here at 8?
I smiled again. I'll see you at 8 then. Dress nice, I said to her with a wink and walked away. I left the place and went back home. It was about 1 p.m. I had a few hours ahead of me. Time to clean the house. Women rarely go on dates with me without being brought to my place after. That's why I had to clean. I started the spring cleaning, starting in the living room and making my way through the kitchen, the hallway, the stairs, the bathroom, and then the bedroom. I made everything look perfect. I had no need to clean the basement. She wasn't going to see anything down there. It was already 6 p.m. at this point. Time to get ready. After the shower and putting on my tux, I was ready, and it was time to leave. I got in the car and drove to where we were supposed to meet, and there she was. She was adorable, wearing a blue knee-high dress. It made her eyes pop. I got out of the car and she saw me. We greeted each other. She told me I looked very handsome, and I told her she was beautiful, and then we were on our way. She picked a rather expensive restaurant, but I didn't mind. I was seated opposite of her, and I got to admire her. Her red cheeks, red lips, and blue eyes. Those fucking eyes. I couldn't get over them. We were there till 11 p.m. We spent our evening talking. She got to know me, and I got to know her. I'd leave her occasionally to get drinks. She ordered red wine, and I ordered the same. But a lot less. I was driving that evening. I couldn't risk anything. She was rather drunk at the end of the evening. She fell asleep in my car. She never got to telling me where she lived, so I had to take her back to my place. She woke once we got there. I helped her in. I helped her get upstairs to my bedroom, and she sort of collapsed on my bed. It was kind of adorable. She then pulled me onto her. I got very busy. She then pulled me onto her, and then I got busy. I got very busy. At least I must have, because she wasn't there in the morning. I hardly remember what happened that night, but I knew I did well. I got out of bed and looked to the floor. I knew I had to clean up again. I looked to the other side of the bed. It was empty. I stood up and treaded myself carefully, trying not to slip and fall. That would have been very unfortunate. I made my way downstairs. The stairs were so messy. Next time, I wouldn't do it upstairs. It'll be easier to clean up that way. I got to the kitchen, and that's when I saw them. Her eyes. I was faced with Jennifer's beautiful eyes. They were so goddamn amazing. I walked closer so I could see them better. Perfect. Perfect round eyes. Blue like the ocean. I was smiling like a 5-year-old at Christmas. As I was admiring her eyes, I heard screams from the basement. That was fairly strange. Usually they die overnight.
Molly Malone was the smartest, funniest, most beautiful girl that I'd ever met. She was my every dream rolled into one. If I could have designed a woman, I couldn't have done better than Molly. She had blonde hair that flowed down her back in a ramrod straight waterfall. When I ran my fingers through it, the light reflected every shade of blonde known to man. She had huge blue eyes, so bright that they may as well have been alive in their own right. She was tall, full-figured, graceful, and light. The best part is that she was mine. I met Molly in my sophomore year at college. We shared a philosophy class together. I pretended to like it just to impress her. As soon as we graduated, I asked her to marry me, and she said yes without hesitation. We were married June of the next year. I work in finance and had a pretty well-paying job, so we were able to afford rent on a nice little townhouse, with painted shutters and a fence, the whole 9 yards. It made Molly happy. It made me happy. For 5 short years, this was our life. There was one thing about Molly that I didn't understand. Molly didn't care much for ink or piercings, but she did have one tattoo. A small one, and it was almost never visible. It was on her back, just a few inches below her neck. A tiny keyhole. No embellishments, no nothing. I always wondered about it. The first time I asked was a few weeks after we'd been dating. Molly usually wore high-collared shirts or scarves, so I hadn't noticed it until that point. When I asked her why she got that tattoo, she seemed a little startled. Then her demeanor softened and she smiled at me.
I'll tell you about it one day. Just not today.
Since we'd only just started dating, I decided not to push it. After all, she would tell me when she was ready. In fact, I mostly forgot about it. It wasn't until I proposed to her that I dared ask again. After she said yes, she practically jumped into my arms. I whispered my question into her ear as I swung her around under the lights of New York City. She stiffened a little as she pulled back to look at me.
One day, I promise, one day I'll tell you. Just not today.
As the wedding drew near, my curiosity deepened. I decided that I would learn the truth on our wedding night. As she pulled me into the bed that we would share, a little shy but excited all the same, I asked the question one more time. This time, her eyes became a little wet, as though on the verge of spilling tears. She sighed and fit herself within my arms, pressing close to me as though for comfort.
I know that you must be so curious. And now that we're husband and wife, there should be no secrets between us. But please, trust me now as you have trusted me these past few years. If you love me, then believe me. One day I'll tell you. Just not today.
From that moment on, I resolved never to ask again. I realized that it wasn't important, one stupid little tattoo. I would wait for her to tell me of her own volition, and the results would be infinitely more satisfying. I conveyed my love to her with my silence, and we basked in happiness. Just before our 5-year anniversary, the relative stability of our life began to tremble when, one night, I touched Molly's tattoo for the very first time. We were lying in bed, and she'd already drifted off to sleep. She always fell asleep before me, but she compensated for it by getting up ridiculously early every morning. As I held her in my arms, enjoying the comfort of her soft warmth, my fingers trailed their way down past her neck. I was surprised when I found a hole situated between her shoulder blades. Alarm rang through my body, and I almost roused her from sleep, until my fingers trailed along the edges, and I realized it was the tattoo. That was when I understood that it wasn't a tattoo at all. Molly had an actual keyhole in her back. For 3 weeks, I didn't say a word to Molly about my discovery. After all, she had promised to tell me when she was ready, and I trusted her. But that didn't stop me from exploring. Every night, when she fell asleep, I would touch the hard edges of the keyhole, mapping the mystery with my fingers. I began paying more attention to her routine while she was awake. I noticed, for the first time, the way she made sure she was always awake before I was, even on the days she had off from work. I also noticed that she went to bed exactly 14 hours after she woke up, each and every day, with absolutely no deviation. My curiosity grew, and my patience began to wane. One night, after Molly was in bed, I committed the ultimate offense. In the darkness of our bedroom, I began to go through her things. It was wrong of me, and I know that now. Believe me, I do. But at the time, I just had to understand. Something was going on with my wife, and it was time for me to find out what. I opened her drawer in the bathroom, but found nothing out of the ordinary. I went through her jewelry, her makeup, and still nothing. Finally, I moved to the bedroom and started for her bedside table. It was locked. Molly and I had matching bedside tables, and I knew that mine didn't have a lock. After a little inspection, I found that Molly had actually added a lock to her own drawer. How had I never seen that before? The lock wasn't very secure, truth be told, and it only took me a moment to use one of Molly's bobby pins to pick it. Holding my breath, I peered inside. How odd it was to find a drawer full of keys. It was a strange assortment with keys of every color. Blue, yellow, green, gray, but they were all the same size, and it was obvious where they were meant to go. I spent a few hours examining those keys, playing with them, wondering about them, until I noticed a few rays of light peeking through the windows. I don't know exactly what possessed me at that moment, looking at my wife's prone body, but I have no excuse for what happened next. I grabbed a blue key and placed it in her keyhole. I gave it 1, 2, 3 turns, and then she began to stir. I threw the key back into the drawer and slammed it shut, hoping she wouldn't be too suspicious when she realized it was unlocked. I threw myself into bed and laid quietly as Molly began to wake up. That day, Molly was different. She seemed confused, disoriented. Mostly she was unhappy, as though a pall had fallen over her usual sunny disposition. I caught her rubbing her back a little throughout the day, as though it was the source of her discomfort. That night, she fell asleep a few hours earlier than usual. That morning, I tried again. This time, I selected a yellow key. Instead of 3 turns, I gave it 6. Molly's sunny disposition came back with a vengeance. Although the undercurrent of confusion was still there, she fell asleep exactly 14 hours after waking up, so I knew that I'd gotten the turns right. Over the next week, I tried a variety of new keys. As time went on, I could feel Molly's disposition towards me changing. Her confusion morphed into a slight coldness, as though she felt betrayed by me. It was foolish for me to think I could keep it a secret from her. From the beginning, she must have known what I was doing. In hindsight, it was so obvious, but the possibility of her discovering my indiscretion didn't stop me. For over a week, my experiment continued. And then, one day, I discovered the black key. The first few times I snooped through the key drawer, I didn't see it. One night, my hand knocked against the back of the drawer, and I felt the wood give just a little. Curious, I pushed harder, until the hidden door to the false back of the drawer gave way, and out fell that black key. It was a little more intricate than the others, with beautiful silver engraving along its body. It was so black that it was hard to see in the dark, but the silver glowed in the moonlight, as though an enchantment lay in my palm. Such a beautiful key. I knew I wanted to use it then and there. As I had done every night before, I wound the key 6 times. Instead of placing it back in the drawer this time, I kept it in my pocket. It was just so gorgeous. That day before I left for work, I watched Molly with a sharp gaze. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. In fact, it seemed as though the black key hadn't done anything at all. I was a little disappointed about that. I left for work out of sorts and unhappy, wondering what she had that key for anyway, or any of them at all for that matter. Thinking back, that was the last happy day of my life, and I wasn't even able to appreciate it. I was too caught up in my wife's secret, the one that I had shamelessly pried open to unworthy eyes. That day, I got off work at 5 as usual. I had finally begun feeling just a little bit guilty about everything I'd done in the past week, so I stopped at the flower shop to buy a dozen lilies, her favorite flower. I got home just a half hour later than usual. Sometimes I wonder if I'd gotten home earlier, if perhaps things would have been different. I opened the door, stepped through the foyer. I walked into the kitchen, only to see a chair toppled over on the floor, and Molly hanging by her neck from the ceiling. She didn't leave a note. I wonder if perhaps that was her final revenge, to leave so much of her life still shrouded in mystery. I know now that if I'd just been patient, if I'd shown myself trustworthy, she would have opened up to me. But I wasn't trustworthy. I betrayed her, and this was a result. I know now what the black key was for, the reason it was hidden. I was the orchestrator of Molly's death, and there's no way to get her back.